Beautiful. So it looks like we're live on YouTube, Facebook. We're here on Zoom. Everyone is joining. Good. All right. Welcome, everyone. We welcome you to this beautiful Sunday, August 14. We have today with us Mr. Mikhail Sergeyev. He has a PhD in religious studies from Temple University from 1997. He is a religion, philosophy, and modern art historian. He has served as an editor of the book series Contemporary Russian Philosophy at Brill Publishers in the Netherlands, and as chair of the Department of Religion, Philosophy, and Theology at the Wilmette Institute. He teaches courses in humanities at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia and the Graduate Theological Union. He is also an affiliate professor at the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities in New Brighton, Minnesota. Sergeyev has published more than 200 scholarly, literary, and journalistic articles in the United States, Canada, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Poland, Czech Republic, Greece, Slovakia, Russia, Japan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan. He is the author and contributing editor of 13 books, including Russian Philosophy in the 21st Century and Anthropology. And you can see that further information at http://uarts.digication, digication.com/M.Sergeyev, MSERGEEV /. So this week's topic, we're going to be talking about Baha'i philosophy and overview. And you can actually purchase a book called Overview, Baha'i Theology and Philosophy, The World of the Baha'i Faith, edited by Robert Stockman. And you can find that online. It's been published. And if you want to purchase a copy of the full publication that we just mentioned, you can go to routledge.com/the world of the Baha'i faith /Stockman. There's a whole link. It's very hard for me to actually repeat that for everyone in a short time. So please come to our website, clearwaterbaha'is.org. You can find stuff on this topic. And also, we'll be putting the link to get to these books in the comments section of these videos on YouTube and Facebook. So if you have trouble finding the book, we are very happy to post a link in the comment section of our videos, the description perhaps as well. Jeremiah, I look forward to working with you to do that. We will, of course, respond to your questions. Just come to clearwaterbaha'is.org if you have trouble finding them. With that being said, Mr. Mikhail, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your beautiful presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And can I share my screen now?
Yes, please do.
Okay, at this point, let us check whether everything is working. At this point, you should see Baha'i philosophy and overview.
Yes.
Okay.
In bottom right, we have your name. If you're intending another slide. Okay,
yes.
Cool.
But as I always tell my friends, you can pronounce my name any way you like it. It is a Russian name. I'm from Russia. But I came to the United States more than 30 years ago, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I haven't been living in Russia for 30 years. So does is the sound okay?
Yes, the sound is fine. Thank you for asking.
Okay, good. So we can begin. I was told that we could have two options. The first option, I do my presentation for about 1 hour, and then we have a Q&A session. The second option is that I do my presentation, but I break my presentation into several sections, and we may have some questions along the way. So I'm not sure which option is better. So let me try to start, and we'll see how it goes. So this is a preview of what you are about to hear. And my topic is philosophy. It seems that it is a very technical topic. If you are familiar with the analytical Anglo-American type of philosophy. But let me assure you that I will be as non-technical as possible. And that's always how I like to introduce philosophy, including Baha'i philosophy. And I will talk about the purpose of philosophy later. So first, I will introduce certain things, then I will make some general remarks. And then we will go on through the main branches of philosophy. Epistemology, which is the discipline that asks the question, how do we know what we know, if we do know anything? Then ontology, a discipline that asks what is actually real, what does exist. Then prophetology, that may sound like an artificial word. It comes from the tradition of Islam. And the prophetology, that part of philosophy is asking the question, how is revelation possible? Then historiosophy, another strange word, which simply means philosophy of history. We will be talking about how Baha'is view history. Then politics and society, ethics and aesthetics, and finally, some words in conclusion. So as far as I know, this is the first, well, again, as far as I know, this is the first comprehensive overview of Baha'i philosophy or Baha'i philosophies. So we'll talk about this later. Let me move on. So some introductory words. My presentation, as it was said already, is based on the article, my article, Overview of Theology and Philosophy, which was published in the volume, The World of the Baha'i Faith. I think it is a great volume. I think it is a master volume, created and edited by Robert Stockman and published this year by Routledge. So you can find my full article if you buy the whole book, but the whole book costs a fortune. So if you are interested particularly in my article, it is available on my website. And here it is. In my presentation, I will avoid extensive quotations. Actually, I will try to avoid quotations. But if you look at the article, you will see all the quotations that I use in order to support my points. Today, for the purpose of presentation, for the purpose of clarity and brevity, I will not do that, but I invite questions about possible sources of my points. And finally, my presentation reflects my personal views on Baha'i philosophy. And it does not express an official position of Baha'i religious authorities on the subject matter. So let's move on to some general remarks. Before we talk about Baha'i philosophy, we have to ask ourselves this basic question: what is philosophy in general? Now, here are two definitions of philosophy. And let me tell you that philosophy is defined and understood by various thinkers, philosophers, non-philosophers in many different ways. So, in fact, the very question of what is philosophy became part of the philosophy itself. The Oxford English Dictionary defines philosophy as a study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. Merriam-Webster describes philosophy as a search for a general understanding of values and reality by chiefly speculative rather than observational means. So as you can see, those definitions are pretty vague. And they usually deal with words like general, fundamental, nature, general understanding, etc., etc. I don't think they give us much, but at least they introduce us to the subject matter. Now, the first question that we should ask ourselves is whether philosophy is science or a discipline. Shoghi Effendi, when he is talking about philosophy in one of his letters, says that philosophy is an important discipline. And I think this understanding of philosophy as a discipline is very precise and is better than, calling it a science. Now, why may we think of philosophy as a science? At the dawn of Western philosophy, Aristotle defined philosophy as the first science, or metaphysics as the first science. So he distinguished between specific sciences that deal with various aspects of nature. And then he thought there is a queen of sciences, which he called metaphysics or philosophy. And the queen of sciences is the most important of sciences because unlike other scientific branches of knowledge, it discusses the essences of things. So philosophy, according to Aristotle, is the science about the essences of things. Now, in modern times, Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest modern philosophers, maybe one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, in his system of philosophy, and more specifically in his book, Critique of Pure Reason, attempted to prove that human beings have no ability to penetrate the essences of things. I'm not going to discuss in detail Kant's philosophy because that will lead us astray, away from our topic of today. But this gigantic shift in understanding philosophy happens and continues to be developed in the 19th and 20th century. Philosophy, Western modern philosophy, seems to have lost its original intention that had been formulated by Aristotle. And since science lost this orientation, discovering the essences of things, modern philosophers, keep trying to formulate new purposes for philosophy, a new understanding of philosophy. Now, in my view, in my personal view, philosophy was never a science. And the purpose of philosophy is not knowledge in the way we see scientific pursuit of knowledge and scientific knowledge. Abdul Baha, by the way, follows Immanuel Kant. Well, he never names, he never calls Kant, he never mentions Kant. He may not have read Kant, but he follows Kant in spirit because Abdul Baha says that human knowledge is limited. And one way it is limited that we cannot know the essences of things. And we know directly. and we can know the essences of things only through their qualities. So if we do not know, if we cannot know the essences of things, and if other scientific branches give us knowledge about various qualities of nature, then why do we need philosophy? So my personal view is that the purpose of philosophy is twofold. First, philosophy has a psychotherapeutic purpose. And second, philosophy has a spiritualistic purpose. I think it is in tune with what Abdu'l-Baha meant when he was talking about divine philosophy. The purpose of divine philosophy, and he distinguishes divine philosophy from natural philosophy. The purpose of divine philosophy is to make us stronger and more knowledgeable in our pursuit of spiritual perfections. And that fulfills the psychotherapeutical purpose of philosophy, because if we do not quite understand what the spirit is and what the spiritual qualities are, what the spiritual life is, what is the difference between our soul and our brain, etc. All those complex questions that have to be studied. So if we do not understand that, we may lose not our mind, but the strength of our psyche. And then the second purpose is spiritualistic, meaning that philosophy should serve as an instrument in our spiritual development. That's how philosophy was viewed in the ancient world. That's how philosophy was studied and developed in India, for example, in Hellenistic world, and that's how philosophy was developed since Socrates. As Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha are saying, that's why those philosophers and their philosophies survived over the millennia, because they were concerned with spiritual issues. Now, moving on to the question of whether there is one philosophy or various philosophies. Now, since philosophy is not strict science, and it is not, because there are no laws that philosophy discovers, and there is no progressive development of systems. In order to study philosophy, you have to study all of it. And that does not happen with science. You have to study the contemporary understanding of science and scientific knowledge. You have to study where science is now. You don't have to study the history of science. But in philosophy, you have to study a history of philosophy in order to understand where we are standing now in terms of philosophical development. So since philosophy is not a strict science, since philosophy is much like art and religion, in other words, it is a spiritual endeavor. Therefore, I don't think we can speak of the Baha'i philosophy, but we may speak later of various Baha'i philosophies, because Baha'i scriptures are so full of meaning and potentialities that they could be the source of various philosophical systems that should not necessarily compete with themselves, but should help various people with various inclinations on their path to spiritual developments. I think that is a very important point to understand, because when people are trying to get it right and to formulate the only true philosophy, they usually end up in narrowing their philosophical perspective. So there are many different philosophical systems, and I think that there will be a variety of Baha'i philosophers in the future. Now, I think I already said a couple of words about the purpose of Baha'i philosophy. It is mostly spiritualistic. Now, a couple of words about technical philosophical vocabulary. Here, Baha'i scriptures, I think, are unique if we compare them to the world religions. Baha'i scriptures explicitly make use of highly technical philosophical vocabulary. That especially applies to Abdul Baha, who was not only the center of the covenant, who was not only the appointed successor and interpreter of the teaching of Baha'u'llah, who was not only the leader of the new religious movement after his father's passing, but who had a very strong and acute philosophical mind, and who used, as I said, quite sophisticatedly, highly technical philosophical vocabulary that mainly came from Aristotle. The question why did he choose Aristotle and not Plato, not Hegel, Kant, etc.? This question, I think, remains open because we do not know what Abdul Baha read, what books did he have. He was not formally educated, but in his tradition of Muslim philosophy, Aristotle was considered as one of the greatest. So it may be that he used Aristotelian philosophical vocabulary because it was fully understood by his contemporaries, but by people with whom he exchanged letters and thoughts and conversations. But anyway, he made use of such Aristotelian terms as essence, substance, essential and accidental attributes, fourfold causality, potentiality and its actualization, and so on. In addition to Aristotelian philosophical vocabulary, Baha'i writings make use of a Neo-Platonist concept of emanation. Now, we have to say that a Neo-Platonist concept of emanation was well studied and used in the Muslim philosophy. But the fact that Abdul Baha or Baha'i writings in general use Aristotelian or Neo-Platonist terminology does not mean that Baha'i thought represents a branch of Aristotelian philosophy or a branch of Neo-Platonism. The founders of the Baha'i faith use Aristotle's approach to study reality in order to develop their own unique philosophical worldview that I think is different from Aristotle in many respects and is different also from classical Islamic philosophy. Now, since Baha'i thought is still in the very early stages of development and without any established philosophical schools, I will discuss it within the comparative framework of what has already been long established in this scholarly field. So therefore, my presentation on Baha'i philosophy will also be a comparative presentation on various other Eastern and Western philosophical ideas. So now moving on to our first section, Epistemology, and just as an experiment, let me ask whether you have any questions so far.
So now would be the time, if anyone in the Zoom has a question, I will check the social media just to make sure. I don't see anything on the social media live stream. So I guess if there's no hands raised, then we can go ahead and continue.
Thank you, Jeremiah. So we are moving on to epistemology. Epistemology, formally speaking, is the philosophical discipline that inquires about the ways we acquire knowledge. How do we know? How do we know that we know anything? What are the sources and the forms of human knowledge? Abdu'l-Baha, in his writings and speeches, distinguishes between two forms of knowledge, subjective and objective, or existential and formal, the same thing. The subjective or existential or intuitive or inner knowledge is refined and perfected by means of meditation. Human intuition is also the source of revelation. So basically, revelation is the extension of intuitive knowledge, but it is reserved only for special human beings, whom Baha'i call the manifestations of God. Abdu'l-Baha also discusses the four sources of human cognition: sensory perception, rationality, inspiration or intuition, and tradition. Let me also make a quick comment about the third one. Now, I think it's pretty obvious what we mean by perception, our sense perception, what we mean by rationality, but it's interesting that Abdu'l-Baha uses inspiration or intuition for the third one, because intuition by itself assumes that we are able to directly know certain things through intuitive penetration, through meditation, while inspiration assumes that this is not we who are about to acquire knowledge, but we are inspired by something or someone who, usually inspiration means that you are inspired by someone. So the inspirer somehow transmits this knowledge to you through the inner processes. For example, Abdu'l-Baha is talking about conversation in dreams, spiritual conversations that we may have with our dead relatives. So in those spiritual conversations, which we may not remember, we may be inspired by someone to do certain things. So I think in this situation, inspiration and intuition are two different modes of inner knowledge. Again, inspiration is coming from someone else, intuition is coming from us. And finally, tradition. By tradition, Abdu'l-Baha means, first of all, sacred tradition, so the tradition of interpretation of sacred scriptures, but also simply folk tradition. For example, in many countries, people have the tradition of folk medicine, and they do not know the source of those remedies, but they know that practically they may work, and therefore they use it. They use them. So Abdu'l-Baha, when he examines those four sources of knowledge, concludes that all of them are liable to error. For example, our senses may betray us when we are in the desert and we want to drink. We may see the mirages that are not there. If we have problems with mental health, we may see hallucinations and we may take them as reality. Also, our senses betray us when it comes to the distances, for example. We may think, and we did think, that the sun revolves around the earth because that's what we observe. So, in other words, sense perception is not the 100% reliable source of knowledge. Now, the same can be said about human rationality, because humans make mistakes all the time. And if we didn't, we would not have debated the fundamental philosophical issues for 2,000 years. Inspiration, the source of inspiration, may not be known to us, and therefore we may be inspired by some beings who have evil intentions. Abdul Baha is talking about satanic inspiration. Tradition is not 100% reliable because it comes from people like us, people who lived before us and who made their recommendations or their interpretations based on their own rationality, and they could also have been mistaken. So therefore, in order to be sure that you arrive at a certainty of truth, Abdul Baha recommends combining all four methods of knowledge in order to arrive again at some kind of certainty. We are talking about human certainty, because human certainty of truth can never be compared to the divine certainty of truth. But when it comes to human certainty, it's better to make sure that the conclusion you arrive at agree with your sense perception, with your reason, with your intuition, and with your tradition. Then you can be certain that at least you've done your best and hopefully arrived at the truth. Now, the third topic that Abdul Baha talks about when it comes to epistemology is the limitation of knowledge. This is my favorite topic personally, because I believe humans always have to have in mind that we are limited in many respects, especially in terms of getting knowledge. Those people who believe that they know everything, I think are, if not the most dangerous, but one of the most dangerous people on earth. People who are sure that they are right and everybody else is wrong. So we have to remember that human knowledge is limited. And as Abdul Baha says, it is limited in at least three main ways. First, human sources of knowledge are liable to error. Even if you arrive at a conclusion that is based on sense perception, rationality, intuition, and tradition, there is a chance, because we all are humans, that somewhere you made some error. Second, we have no access to the essences of the objects of cognition. We have no access to the essences of things. It is here that I think Abdul Baha echoes Immanuel Kant, although he never mentions Kant, and he does not share the Kantian system of thought. Third, Abdul Baha says that lower forms of life cannot comprehend the higher ones. Here on Earth, we may think that we are the higher forms of life, since animals, plants, minerals are all lower forms of life. But the fact that we cannot perceive the higher forms of life does not mean that they do not exist. In fact, it is why we cannot perceive them, because they are higher than we are, and therefore we have no adequate instruments of knowledge to perceive the spiritual real. So the end result of Abdul Baha's overview of epistemological issues is as follows. I quote, "All available human criteria or standards of knowledge are erroneous and defective but the divine standard of knowledge is infallible. So only the divine standard of knowledge is 100% infallible. So now we are moving to ontology. I will not ask for questions this time. So maybe after we discuss ontology, we can make a short break and see maybe you have some questions. What is ontology, first of all? Ontology is the branch of philosophy that asks the question, what is reality? Or what does really exist? It may seem like a fully stupid question or foolish question, but we all know that what we see is not what is real. According to our modern science, the sugar is not sweet, the grass is not green, the sky is not blue. Why? Because when we taste the sugar, the sweetness that we feel is not the property of sugar, but it is the property of the brain that uses certain mechanisms to turn on the perceptor that gives us the feeling of sweetness. And if those perceptors are not working in the right way, we may taste sugar and feel that it is sour. People who do not recognize color cannot see the blue sky, etc. So what we see is not what really exists. And philosophers realized that long time ago. So in the history of philosophy, there are three main types of ontologies or ontological systems. They are called monism, dualism, and pluralism. A monist philosophy is trying to reduce all the multiplicity of objects that we encounter in this world to only one. Not necessarily God. Different philosophical systems are working with different premises and come to different conclusions. For example, atheists believe that everything that we observe in the universe can be reduced to only one thing, matter or energy. Chinese philosophers of Taoism believe that everything can be reduced to Tao, but no one knows what Tao is, because Tao is an entity that denies any definition, etc. So when you have a philosophy that is reducing all the multiplicity of objects into one thing, you have monism. Now, dualism does the same, but comes to the duality. For example, a philosophy that says all visible and invisible objects can be reduced to spirit and matter would be a dualistic philosophy. Or a system, a Chinese philosophy of yin and yang, presupposes that our universe can never be reduced to one principle. It always goes in pairs. Whereas yin, there is yang, etc. And finally, pluralism. Pluralist philosophy affirms that you cannot reduce the multiplicity of our perceived objects in the universe to anything that is one. So from the perspective of the history of philosophy, Baha'i ontology offers a comprehensive and conciliatory approach by accommodating all those three types of ontological traditions. So that's why I personally call Baha'i ontology relativistic, but relativistic not in a negative sense that it relativizes those types of ontologies, but relativistic in a synthesizing sense, in the sense of wisdom that sees all those three types from three different perspectives. So let me be more concrete. Abdu'l-Baha says that everything in creation exists in its own right and on its own level. He says that there is no such thing as absolute nothingness. Everything exists. And therefore, we may talk about the irreducible nature of multiplicity, which is the hallmark of pluralism. However, among those things that exist, there is God. And in comparison to the Almighty, no part of creation could really claim true existence. So yes, we all exist in our own right, but our existence in comparison with God's existence is like non-existence. So therefore, if you look at the world from this perspective, you will develop a monist philosophy that says that God only exists and everyone else simply shares certain portions of this pre-existent and eternal creator. God's creation is also infinite and ever existing, and therefore the relation between God and his creation is that of emanation. Emanation, as I said before, is a Neo-Platonic term and is used by Abdu'l-Baha in the sense of infinite creation. Emanation is infinite creation, creation that never stops. And emanation is that process by which God or the Holy Spirit creates everything that is of different nature from the Creator himself. Abdu'l-Baha gives a metaphor of a writer and a writing. It's like the novelist writes the novel, and the novel is of different nature from the novelist. However, the novelist is the author of the novel and has full knowledge of how the novel will develop. Now, as for the world of creation, Abdu'l-Baha divides it into two categories, matter and spirit. That's what we observe. And that represents a dualistic form or a dualistic perspective in Baha'i philosophy. So now we move on to human nature, and let me make a small break. Let me ask about questions.
Would you mind?
Hi, we do have one question from social media. It says, what is meant by the essences of things? Is it a metaphysical attribute?
Abdu'l-Baha uses the term essences in its Aristotelian sense. The essence of a thing is that by which this thing exists as this thing. So for example, we have a chair. You can look at the chair from different perspectives, from the perspectives of physics, from the perspectives of the material out of which the chair was made, from the perspective of the chair's design, from the perspective of the purpose of that particular chair. But the philosophical question would be, what is the essence of the chair? Or as medieval philosophers would ask, what is the chairness of the chair? What is the whatness of the chair? In other words, what is that thing without which the chair will not exist as a chair? This idea of an essence was developed by different philosophers in a very different way. For Plato, the essence would be the form of the chair, the idea of the chair, the template according to which this chair was made. Modern philosophy rejected the very idea of essences and deals only with qualities. But as I said, modern philosophy finds itself in a deep crisis because it lost, after Kant, it lost its main subject of study, the essences of things, things as they are. And therefore, they are trying to somehow bypass the very question about essences. You may also say that the question of essences is about the question of things as they are in themselves. So things that we observe by our senses, even by our reason, are things as they are given to us, to our perception. But philosophy is trying to penetrate the essences of things, meaning philosophy is trying to see things as they are, not as they appear to our perception. So that's how I would describe the term essence, which completely disappeared from modern science, by the way.
Thank you. Alex, you had your hand raised. Would you like to ask your question now?
My question, I had the exact same question about essences, and you just addressed it. I think, the statement, we can't know the essence of anything. It's a sort of a shocking statement, but I'm trying to think of this in terms of Baha'i belief that it's not that God is unknowable, but that the essence of God is unknowable. So you really addressed the question, but tell me, is my thinking right here that we don't know the essence of a thing, but we can know a thing by its attributes? Is that the way we know a thing?
Yes, we can know a thing by those attributes or qualities that are given to us in perception. So we do not know God, but we can know the will of God through God's prophets or God's manifestations. We do not know the essence of the world. We do not know the essence of nature. We know nature only as it appears to us. So as it appears to us, we can discover its laws, we can discover certain features of nature, but we do not know the essence of it. It's again, as I understand it, the world we live in may be very different from how we perceive it, because we perceive it the way our brain is functioning. But our brain is a certain device that gives us ability to perceive the world in a certain way. However, when we die and our spiritual senses develop, we may encounter a totally different world that would also include the material world we live in now. Because again, what we call matter is simply a reality that we discover through our senses and reason, and our senses and reason are limited. So the world we live in may be the spiritual world, and angels or spiritual beings may be around us, but we have no way to perceive them. That's, I think, what Baha'i teachings call the essences of things. We do not know what things really are. We operate only within the limits of our sensory perception and rationality. I think this is a very liberating thought, actually, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to live when you think that you know everything, and this is the only world we live in. Does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Let's go ahead and continue on with the presentation, and we can stop again if we need to.
Yeah, okay. So let us move on to anthropology. Anthropology is a scholarly word for philosophy of human nature. And religious philosophy, no matter what religion we discuss, usually asserts that human beings possess both a physical body and a spiritual soul or eternal soul. In addition, various thinkers have argued that humans are either good by nature or evil by nature, or both good and evil, or neither good nor evil. These are all possible ways to describe our nature. So, for example, Christianity teaches about the original sin, that we are evil, not by original nature, but after the fall of Adam and Eve. Let's say Plato and Aristotle teach that our nature is originally good. And so is Mencius, the disciple of Confucius. Some philosophers, like Jewish rabbis, tell us that humans have both good and evil impulses, and we always have to choose between the two. And sometimes we choose good, sometimes we choose evil, and that's how we progress or regress. That's how we learn from our mistakes. And finally, John Locke, the father of modern liberalism, proposed his own theory that we are born as tabula rasa, meaning blank slate, neither good nor evil. And we become good and evil, and we accumulate our knowledge through our experience, external experience, and communication with other people. So what do Baha'i teachings say about human nature and goodness or not goodness of it? As in previous cases, Baha'i teachings accommodate all of those approaches. So that they present a complex philosophy by distinguishing between humans' perfect divine origin and foundation. So we may say that all humans are by nature good and perfect when it comes to their divine origin. Then it's meaning human nature's susceptibility to evil regarding inherited and material aspects, which means that all of us inherit certain traits from our parents, and some of the traits of our characters may be weak, and therefore we will be susceptible to evil things. Where, for example, we all know that if our parents were alcoholic, their children have a much greater chance of becoming alcoholics. It doesn't mean that they will, but they have a greater chance. They are more susceptible. And also, Baha'i teachings say that human beings are complex beings. We have our material body and we have our eternal soul. But material body and eternal soul are in opposition to each other because they represent two different levels of existence. So we are at the border between materiality and spirituality. What is perfect for our body is evil for our soul. What is perfect for our soul is maybe highly disliked by our material nature. So therefore, this opposition between body and soul or spirit, our material level of existence, also makes us susceptible to evil. And from this perspective, we may say that we may be evil, and we are both good and evil, depending on how we live our life. And finally, Baha'i teachings assert neutrality when it comes to personal choices in education. Abdu'l-Baha stresses the importance of education because education can overcome the inherited traits, the education can overcome many weaknesses that we experience in our lives. So when it comes to our personal choices, our nature is neutral because our moral choice is always within our reach. Now, next point, which is, I think, is extremely important for contemporary discussion of transhumanism and singularity, those desires, intentions to merge computer technology with human biology. This is a cutting-edge Western thought. If you, I'm pretty sure you've read something about that, but I would recommend Ray Kurzweil, a contemporary American inventor, genius, who invented the keyboard among many other things, and who is a best-selling author. He talks about these topics, and actually, I would argue with him. So the Baha'i writings offer a distinctive philosophy of mind by distinguishing the human body, mind, and spirit from each other. The mind, which is associated with the brain, serves as an interface between the rational soul or spirit and the physical body. So when the body deteriorates, the powers of our human mind weaken. And that's what explains mental illnesses like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, etc., etc. But it does not mean that the soul, which is not material but spiritual, is in any way affected by our mind weakening, because the soul is the source of those powers and it remains intact no matter what kind of suffering and illness we undergo in our material body. I think this distinction between mind and soul is extremely important, first of all, in psychotherapy, because when you come to psychotherapy and your psychotherapist is trying to basically change your mind and your attitudes, you have to realize that the psychotherapist is not involved with your spirituality, with your soul. The psychotherapist is involved with your brain, which is the transmitter of the powers of the soul, and the powers of the soul are your mind. And second, the distinction between the mind and the soul is crucial when we are trying to understand what will happen when robots will be smarter than us. The idea that machines are running faster than we do, or playing chess better than we do, or lift weights, heavier than we do, does not bother us, because we associate our identity not with our hands, not with our capacity to run, not even with our capacity to play chess. We associate our identity with our thoughts. And when people like Ray Kurzweil tell us that there will come a time when the robots will be smarter than we are, that may create an illusion that we actually invented a being that is higher than we are. Now, this is an illusion because our thinking process, which is related to our brain, is not what we call I or myself. It is simply the power of the soul that is transmitted through the brain, which is a complex organ. And the fact that we may create some robots that are smarter than we are simply tells us that we are more than our thoughts, that we have capacities, spiritual capacities that transcend the mental capacities of our brain, including our rational abilities. And I think that is very, very important to understand. Now, before we talk about prophetology, any questions about human nature?
We did have a comment from one of our guests in Zoom, and it has to do with what do you know, what is your understanding of the contemporary thought process as far as among academics or among philosophers in trying to understand where they're coming from a school of thought, and how we engage as Baha'is in that dialogue to benefit from their understanding, as well as being able to promote the teachings and those ideals? Like, where's the mutual exchange? And do you know of any contemporary, whether it's among mathematicians, whether it's among philosophers or physicists, or any spectrum of understanding, where we're making inroads and where some of those concepts and those understandings and that knowledge base is being applied within the framework of the faith and the writings?
Look, first of all, let me say that I'm not a math person, although I did well in math in high school, extremely well. But it was about 50 years ago, and I'm not following mathematicians. I admire them, but I cannot say anything about math. And actually, I cannot say much about science because knowledge is so broad nowadays that you have to concentrate on certain issues in a certain field. My field is philosophy and religion. I can say, however, about human nature and philosophy of mind, because this branch of philosophy is at the intersection between science, technology, and philosophy. It is getting more and more practical because now we can already imitate our feelings. We are close to being able to download bits of memories. We can now interact with brain. We can put some chips in the brain, and a person who has no ability to move their legs or arms can use this chip, and by the power of their thought could move and do something. So it is getting closer and closer to creating an artificial intelligence, and I think that is the most promising and the most fascinating field of science nowadays, at least for me, the merging of human biology and computer technology. Obviously, when I talk about biology, I'm talking about neurobiology, creation of artificial neural networks. Now, here is the concept, the basic concept, which is accepted by most scientists who work in this field, including Ray Kurzweil, whom I mentioned. This concept of human nature was developed by John Locke, who also thought about tabula rasa. But he thought of human nature being how shall I put it, a cluster of psychological thoughts and memories that we develop throughout our whole life, that is supported by the brain. So in other words, that has a biological platform, and that is relatively independent of this platform. This idea of human nature is a working hypothesis for most of contemporary scientists who work on artificial intelligence. The second major premise that they do have is that computer brain is basically a very sophisticated and complex computer. Now, given those two hypotheses, they are trying to recreate the workings of the human brain and being able to transfer this artificial brain into an artificial technological platform, not a biological platform. Why? Because they believe that our psyche is relatively independent of our body, although it is connected to our body and it was produced on the basis of our body. So as a result of those two hypotheses, they believe that when they are able to do that, they will be able to prolong human life indefinitely, because we may be able to download to a computer, a technological platform, the whole content of our brain, including our memories, including our feelings, including our even subconsciousness maybe, and therefore we could reproduce ourselves as robots. And the intersection between this idea and the Baha'i ideas about the soul is quite clear. Because if we can do this, and I think we can, we will be able to do that. But it will not mean that we can reproduce ourselves. We can make a copy of our material self, yes. But we will not be able to reproduce the source of ourselves, which is spiritual. And therefore, yes, I think we will be able to create brain implants so perfect that, you know, instead of heart implant, we may implant an artificial brain into someone's head, and this person will be functioning. But he or she will not be functioning because we recreated this person. He or she will be functioning because this artificial brain will be able to retain connection to the spiritual soul. So in other words, Baha'i views, which are not only Baha'i views, they are generally speaking religious views. Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they all are teaching the same here, that our soul is spiritual, not material. This religious conception of human nature is radically opposed to contemporary secular idea of human nature, which was proposed by John Locke. Yes, this is the intersection that would be very fruitful, but at this point, it is purely theoretical. When we come to the point when we can actually recreate the complexity of the human brain, I think humans will realize that human brain is not what we call ourselves. Have I answered this question at least partially?
I think in the concept of how it follows along the context of the historical analysis from a timeline perspective of how these ideas came to be, you've answered it. I think the question is more along the lines of what are we right now currently, how are we engaging with contemporary thought leaders, and how those thoughts are being influenced both in the religious community and outside of the religious community, and how they play with each other, and whether or not there's any chance that there will be some unification in regards to that, or are we just along these two separate endeavors?
Look, there are many intellectual leaders, let's say in the United States, and you can dialogue with them simply by writing a paper and sending this paper to them, or going to the conference, engaging in dialogue. For example, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the United States, Samuel Huntington and Francis Fukuyama published their famous two books, Huntington about the conflict of civilizations and Fukuyama about the end of history. Two different visions of American democracy. Fukuyama promoted the idea that American democracy is the ultimate end of history because it is the best way to organize human affairs. And Huntington telling us that the American democracy is unique to the West. It cannot be transported or transplanted into other parts of the world. That we should, take it easy and trying to coexist. So, for example, here we have a philosophy of history, and Baha'is do have their own philosophy of history, and we may engage, of course, and we do engage with them, if not personally, face to face, but intellectually by using their concepts and agreeing with certain parts of them and disagreeing with others. This is a common intellectual process that is going on in many fields. In fact, the book series that I'm publishing, the Global Faith book series, has this very purpose. I'm trying to collect all the articles by Baha'i scholars on certain topics. For example, we published a book on Baha'i epistemology. On certain topics, give the reader the overall understanding of where Baha'is are standing in this particular topic, what has been written, what has been addressed, what contemporary thinkers have been criticized or not criticized, etc. So that from that point on, we can move forward and engage even more with contemporary intellectual leaders. I don't think that these two processes are going to either converge or completely go apart from each other, because certain things that people are saying are definitely true, even if those people come from the opposing camp of atheists. The new atheists, the new American atheists like Dawkins and late Christopher Hitchens, etc., they were certainly right that religion, if we are talking about 2,000 years of human history, religion brought with it a lot of violence. You cannot argue against that, etc. So I think the intellectual dialogue is going on. It will be going on, and it will be broader, and it may not necessarily come to a complete conversion. I do not agree with complete conversion, because people never think the same. They always think differently. But I think Baha'i thought at this point is at the stage when we can thoughtfully and successfully engage the most eminent Western thinkers in their own fields.
Okay, one last question, then we'll move on. So would you say that any of your thought, any of the way that you approach this philosophy has been influenced by any of your any of these contemporary thinkers, or is it solely based within the context of the Baha'i writings?
No, it is not solely based on the Baha'i writings. It is impossible, I think, to create any kind of philosophy if you do not study past thinkers and contemporary thinkers. I think it's a very narrow-minded approach, even if you believe that Baha'i philosophy is divinely inspired, because divine inspiration comes in such a form as to contain the potentialities of many ideas and many philosophies and many schools of thoughts. We know that every religion produced dozens schools of thought that coexisted with each other. So personally, for me, I've studied, first of all, I've studied religion professionally. I have a PhD in the history of religions. I taught Asian religions, I taught American religions, I taught Intro to the Bible, I taught other courses So I have a very solid knowledge in the history of religions, and I always have in mind my knowledge of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, first of all, because it is very important, as I said, to check your ideas against what has already been said. In terms of philosophy, I've studied ancient philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, of course, classical Indian philosophy, classical Chinese philosophy, modern philosophy. Now I'm particularly studying Western philosophers of the second half of the 20th century. Let me put it this way. So yes, and plus, I always remember Shoghi Effendi, who said that the purpose of philosophy is to rethink, reinterpret the Baha'i teachings in terms of contemporary intellectual situation. If you do not know contemporary intellectual situation, you cannot interpret anything. You simply talk to yourself. And that is not healthy, and that is not leading Baha'i faith anywhere.
Thank you. John, do you have anything to say, or should we continue on?
Look,
Mikhail,
yeah.
I have a question for you that was, I think, very relevant to some of the things you mentioned, and it has to do with, of course, epistemology. How do we know what we know in one simple sense? But in another, you had mentioned some conjecture that is held, and you may possibly share, with regards to, for example, the advances of our technology to copy things that we believe we can copy. For example, human minds, for example, or human brains. I think you specifically had spoken to. This comes to a dilemma of expression versus conjecture, or deduction versus induction. So, for example, you can reduce a lot of what we do, how we manifest what we do, to a series of chemical signals that the brain will create, so that the body part, such as this hand that I move in front of me, can do so. So you are able to, of course, create electrical signals through your biological processes, and then it allows for movement to occur. So that, we can agree, is something that is manifested because of either the choice of the brain or involuntary actions, such as your heartbeat, that must occur regardless of whether you choose or not. Of course, we can talk about the physical manifestations, but the essences and what is not expressed is equally present, but yet not there. So, for example, we can comprehend attributes that are expressed. In biology, they call that phenotypes. However, the recessive traits that may compose your genotype, what your genetic material may contain, may not ever be expressed in your lifetime. It may be something that's passed on through inheritance, as you had mentioned, inheritance versus what is learned. Our behavior, of course, can change, but it is still upon a stimulus of our environment, subject to that stimulus for what you may have or may not have to be expressed upon that moment. For example, you could raise a pig in a domestic environment. You never know they can grow tusks. You never know that it can grow anything if you've never seen a wild boar. But if you let that pig out into the wilds, that pig becomes wild. It doesn't stay domestic. It becomes a wild animal. And it grows body parts that you would never see had it not been exposed to the environment outside of the home that it knew until you sent it to the wilds. Why I'm mentioning all this is that there is a stark difference between manifestation of attributes, and what I understand in the Baha'i writings currently is that we don't know God, and everything that we know as virtues or attributes of God is as they are expressed in this realm of existence that we share, that we have a common medium to express through language, if at all. But there's all the attributes that God has that are not expressed in this realm of reality that God also has, which also adds to the infinitude of God being a higher nature than us, not being able to be comprehended by us, and so forth. I mention this because there's this saying that I'm going to paraphrase, that once you've known yourself, you've known God. And I feel that this saying very much encapsulates the knowledge of oneself being also unattainable. So therefore, if I'm unable to know myself, that is not my ego per se, but my soul, my spirit, I don't, even if we were to develop a completely new human body, I don't envision, despite all the tools we may develop to either address our enhanced expression in this world, or to replace body parts where we would want to express ourselves with them, I don't see that ever being able to actually develop a true copy of a human being in any sense, in the context that looking at what is manifested may not even be half the story of what it means to be human. Although we have in many scientific realms reduced ourselves to what we express ourselves to be, what is expressed physically, there is much that is not expressed physically in our genotypic, in our DNA, in that identity, and then yet even more in our spiritual identity. The idea in the Baha'i writings that we are tested in this world. There's this idea that with fire, the gold is tested, and that we as human beings are tested with gold itself. So the very presence or lack thereof of resources in our life, meaning money, water, food, all of these things that if we're left without it may cause us to be in a situation where we may contemplate stealing someone else's things. All of this is stimulus for us to choose whether we want to make a decision to, again, if we have no resources, to take it from someone else. So to mention this, I think that there's a big question when you had talked about being able to copy human beings. I think there's a big question as to whether we truly can do so. Do you believe that aside from maybe copying body parts that we can use, or we can, again, understand what brain signals it requires to move, say, an arm, you can reconnect a new arm to the human being, robotic, synthetic, what have you, and do that. But you can't actually, so to speak, download and upload a being as in an avatar into another physical form.
Okay. So the bottom line is that, as I said, I do not believe that as humans we can recreate ourselves fully. We cannot recreate our spiritual soul. Number one. Number two, as for what we can do, I don't know. Science will tell us, because at this point, look, we do not even know the nature of consciousness. If you go to a hospital, you know, they have machines that register your heartbeat, but they do not have machines that register the existence of consciousness. The only way the doctor can tell whether you are conscious or not is to ask you. So we are in this way, we are kind of on a primitive stage of medicine. So when when scientists realize the nature of consciousness, I don't know whether they can or they won't, we'll see what parts of the brain could be copied or could not be copied. But brain is a material object, and so is DNA. So maybe we could create computers that could encode all DNAs and all their functions, and we can recreate the human DNA. But even we recreate the human DNA, even if we recreate the human consciousness, even if we recreate the human self-consciousness, we cannot, by definition, recreate our spiritual self. That's my view. Because our spiritual self is a higher form of us, and the lower form.
Would you synonymize it to a emergent property?
Say it again.
Would you synonymize it to an emergent property of what we are?
You mean spiritual self?
Yes.
No, spiritual self is not an emergent property.
So would our physical form be the emergent property, or?
Yes, our mind may be the emergent property, but it is the emergent property from the point of view of material science. But I don't think the brain is the producer of thought. The brain is the transmitter of thought. And when the brain is able to transmit the thought, then those properties emerge. But they do not emerge from the brain per se. They emerge from our spiritual self and spiritual qualities. And that we won't be able to copy.
So hypothetically, from a point of view of a spiritualist who acknowledges the necessity for the material world, of course, this soul that we have and this body that we have together in their combined expression, in a sense, create the emergent property what we know as the mind together.
Say it again.
So the combination of our spirit, it's linked to our body. That is the physical tool we have to view the world together, because of the transmitter that we require, the brain, in order to even communicate in this world, as you would say, an avatar. That combination, that linkage, that growth together is what allows the emergent property that we know as the mind.
Yes, I would agree with that. But we do not know, and science does not know.
So we've been able to prove in science that you can remove a whole hemisphere of the brain and still have a human being that can function, has consciousness.
I think it's possible.
It's been established. People can do that. It's happened. They've, in children, removed the whole hemisphere, not in adults, but in children. They've removed the whole half of their brain, because they had some very terrible condition. They removed half of the brain, and the child has been able to grow and somewhat, as we understand, live a normal life. What normal means, how we define it, that's another story.
That's because the brain is such a wondrous organ that all its parts are interrelated. If you take one part, other parts can actually do the work. But the question is whether you can remove the whole brain. And
very good question.
And put an implant, a brain implant, that would recreate the workings of the brain. That's what we do with the heart, with the lungs, now with the liver. Whether we can attain such a stage of medical development that we can actually create a brain implant, whether the person will still be able to function and be the same. That is the question. It is the question of human identity. Artificial intelligence scientists believe that it is possible, but not because we have a soul, but because humans will have the ability to recreate the human brain. And the human brain is the storage of our identity. And my point was that religious people of all religions have a different point of view about human identity. Human identity is maybe connected with our brain, but it is not in our brain. And if we have a brain implant, it may recreate our memories and feelings, etc. But what is essential is for this implant to be able to have the same connection with the source of our identity. And nobody knows whether we can do this or not.
Thank you so much, Mikhail.
Thank you.
We're running out of time, so I would like to, depending on how many more slides we have.
Look, I have so many slides that, frankly, I would propose to continue on another day. I will simply start with this slide, prophetology, because at least 10, I think 9 or 10 more slides.
Okay, that sounds good to me. We'll schedule it for part 2 of this series. So let's go ahead and do the wrap up, John.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, Mr. Mikhail Sergeyev, thank you, and please correct me if I'm pronouncing anything incorrectly. I appreciate it very much.
Fine.
With that being said, we really thank you for being a speaker today with Clearwater Baha'is to come here and discuss these very important questions about why, the answer to why, the question why. And for many people, this question, asking why, is oftentimes left unanswered. And as you know, questioning how do you know what you know is not something as vogue today with regards to spiritual subjects, which, as you had mentioned, is even in the realm of epistemology and philosophy sometimes heavily neglected. That being said, we have so much room to discuss in our next session, the rest of this presentation that you've prepared for us, and we really appreciate this part that we've seen today. That being said, all of you who are joining us on Zoom, on YouTube, on Facebook, we welcome you to stay in touch as we are going to continue our next session soon. We have, of course, in the comment section and in the description of the videos on YouTube and on Facebook, the links for the materials that we were referring to in the beginning. We're posting them there. We appreciate your patience. First and foremost, if you want to come to the Zoom meeting, we will post usually within the week prior the description of what will be spoken about. So please go to www.clearwaterbaha'is.org. That is CLEARWATERBAHAIS.org. And if for whatever reason I misspelled it, I'm not reading off a screen, I'm saying it from memory, my apologies. But clearwaterbaha'is.org is the website. And we thank you so much for joining us this Sunday, Mr. Mikhail. Do you have any closing words you'd like to discuss?
Look, thank you for inviting me. I did not anticipate so many questions, and it is great. The more questions, the better. I'm happy that my presentation encouraged people to ask those questions, and we have, I think, one more. I have Lodro Siering is raising his hand. Maybe we should end up by listening to his question.
Sure. I just wanted to ask you earlier if you're familiar with the Austrian physicist Anton Zeilinger and his teams of experiments over the last decade, which have pretty conclusively falsified local realism. Because so much of the presupposition of, like, say, the discussion that John added is based on things that we now know have been scientifically disproven. Material reality simply does not exist in the way that we naively assume it to exist. We know this through the amount of experimentation that have taken Bill's inequality to, these experiments are really as good as it gets.
So could you please?
And let me just finish, and then you can respond, because I think you have a lot to say on this, or you have something to respond to this. So whatever the Baha'i faith means by material reality, it can't be what we naively assume it to mean, right? And that adds a whole nother dimension to the discussion. But it's something that's kind of on the cutting edge, and it hasn't filtered into, like, layman's understanding of reality. And I think that it doesn't allow us to really get to the point that we could be getting to if we just understand that even though the world, for a variety of reasons, is stuck on materialism, that scientifically it's an untenable belief system.
Did I hear you mentioning Lenin?
No, I said Anton Zeilinger.
Yeah.
Anton Zeilinger, is that the experiments?
Sorry.
Would you
Anton Zeilinger is the scientist that has these experiments. Is that correct?
Yeah, he's an Australian physicist, Austrian physicist. He actually has a whole a team, and basically from 2006 through the teens, he's done a lot of experiments carrying out what Bill's inequality, which technically tests local realism, saying, which is the way. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, he's a physicist, and the sum of this is that we know that material reality can't exist the way that we assume it, the way we all assume it exists, just the way that we assume that the world is flat and we're at the center of it, right? But so much of our thinking, when we get into philosophy and we ask like mind-body problems, is still contaminated by a naive assumption about materialism that in the future won't even be relevant to the discussion, because we already know that it can't be, scientifically it just isn't. But naive realism is a really strong psychological, it's hard for us to abandon it, right?
Look, yeah, that actually perfectly fits the Buddhist understanding of matter. But could you please send me the link to this author?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if you could share that, Lodro, on the comments of the Facebook. If also you get to the YouTube, we appreciate it. Yes. So people can look at that.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Mikhail, can you provide a public email so that people can contact you directly with any further questions?
Yes, of course I can. How should I do that?
You can just say it right now, and then I'll be sure to add it on the videos.
Can I simply put it in the chat?
Yes, you can. We can read it out. Yes, no problem. So Jeremiah, please be sure to copy the email he's pasting right now before we close up. So it's msergeev@comcast.net. It's msergeev@comcast.net. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. And
repeat it again, please.
Okay. It is MS ER MSERGEEV@comcast.net. MSERGEEV@comcast.net. Lodro, to answer your question, just post it on the YouTube if you're able to get onto the YouTube, and then we can transpose that to the Facebook. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a beautiful Sunday. We appreciate it that you were able to be stimulating as well from the audience to provide information. And we look forward to addressing this in the next session, continuing these series. Bye-bye now. Happy Sunday.